Well, it's already been worth the trip here. First of all, to see that terrific presentation just now, take a slice of the action. I just love that. And I want to thank Dr. Don Waite. Is he still in the room, or is he off with the kids? Probably off with the kids. Anyway, that was a lot more inspiring than anything I could do. So take the inspiration part from that, and maybe I can add a little bit in terms of an action plan around how we might achieve some of the dreams that were in those wide eyes that we just saw up here a few minutes ago. Secondly, I've just spent the last hour or so learning about the yellow quill experience, and I'm really glad that I had a chance to sit at this table and to learn about the kind of struggle, kind of community struggle that's been underway at Yellow Quill over the last really 2 decades. And it's a story that has a powerful and positive ending, but it took far too long to reach that point. And it certainly has me inspired to see if we can't do some things to speed up action of the kind that we saw at Yellow Quill. And I know you've all had a presentation about it, and you probably all know a lot more about it than I do, but I'm hoping that the next time I'm in the neighborhood that I can accept the invitation that I was so graciously given to come and visit the project. I grew up on the Ottawa River, about halfway between Ottawa and Montreal, and we used to swim in the Ottawa River. It's a pretty big river, big body of water. And in those days, there was a beach, and we all swam and took our swimming lessons there, and so on and so forth, until it was discovered that kids were starting to get sick who were spending the whole summer playing around in the water. And when they got to the bottom of it, they found out that it was the sewage coming down from Ottawa. I know that's a metaphor that some people think, captures a certain kind of Canadian reality, but in our case, it was a fairly practical interaction with the Ottawa scene that wasn't very pleasant. Our little town then decided the solution was to build a swimming pool with chlorinated water right beside the beach and close the beach, which is what happened. And meanwhile, of course, the sewage just kept floating on by down to Akwesasne, where the beach was still open, and the First Nations kids could swim there. Much later in my life, I began to understand some of the injustices that were inherent in that little story about communities that had income and power and could afford to build a swimming pool for their kids, and other communities that didn't have access to those kind of resources and were being neglected. Eventually, the people of Akwesasne spoke out about these kinds of issues in a fairly dramatic way that most of us can reflect upon. I detected a certain kind of boiling anger in our conversation about Yellow Quill, because it really appears as though what's been going on in small, particularly First Nations communities, is what I guess I can't remember whether it was Paul, whether you made this comment also on the way in, but it's a little bit like we have these slow one-by-one Walkertons unfolding as people become sick and die prematurely in the communities whose water is not being attended to, and for whom there seems to be no answers and relatively little interest. If we were ever able to document the impact of poor water quality on the mortality rates in First Nations communities, I have a feeling that it would be shocking. And we shouldn't wait until we get that data. We should follow the example of the people in Yellow Quill and some of the other communities and get on to bringing some solutions forward. Well, why hasn't that been happening? We do have a Department of Indian Affairs located, I note, in Ottawa, the self-same source of the pollution that we were dealing with when I was a kid, an awful long way from the communities that are being affected. We have discovered over the years, through both our party and I think other parties are beginning to realize this, that First Nations, Aboriginal peoples have by and large been treated with a certain kind of quite disgusting paternalism and father knows best attitude, or worse, discrimination by our national government. And it's time for that to end. And to that end, our party is committing itself to put a real focus on Aboriginal issues and work with First Nations representatives, Métis representatives, the representatives of the Innu people to bring these issues into the House of Commons. And the first thing I wanted to tell you was that, in case you noticed, there was a press conference of the three opposition party leaders last week, Mr. Harper and myself and Mr. Duceppe. And one of the proposals I brought to the other leaders, which they accepted, was that we should create in the House of Commons a standing committee on Aboriginal issues that deals only and exclusively with those questions. And we'll then be proposing to the House that we work with First Nations organizations to have a permanent seat at the table in that standing committee for First Nations representation. Up till now, kind of, I think, ironically or sadly, the committee responsible for Aboriginal issues in the House of Commons has actually been called the Committee for Aboriginal Issues and Natural Resources. In other words, there's some kind of a bizarre juxtaposition of these two issues. And the result in the House of Commons has been that we've ended up with members of Parliament who are mostly interested in the issues of the big mining companies, the big oil companies, the big forestry companies, sitting on that committee and having to also address the issues of Aboriginal people. It's resulted in a completely inadequate response to the fundamental relationship that Canada should be having with First Nations and Aboriginal people across the country. And it's time that it changed. And I think that that's really where this issue has to start, is with a changed relationship, as the AFN has been saying, and that we begin to deal with Aboriginal people on a nation-to-nation basis, looking each other in the eye, instead of from on high, which has been the traditional attitude. And so we'll be working very hard with First Nations communities and organizations to try to transform that culture in Ottawa. I know I haven't really said much about water so far. I've been talking more about politics. But you know, in many ways, what's been happening to our water ecosystems has everything to do with politics. It has everything to do with the power structure and who makes what kinds of decisions with what kinds of consequences. And the decisions that we make all too often, particularly when it comes to water and watersheds, can have terrible consequences, oftentimes on other people, not ourselves. And this is what we've seen unfolding in many of these communities. And the response has got to be to organize, to push back against this kind of influence. In other words, there's a role that other people, other than the scientists, I know a lot of these kids wanted to go on and become scientists, and we're really happy to have the presentation of the scientists here, but there's a really important role for people other than the scientists in this whole project. And that's the political role. That's the role of exercising public pressure to create change. Our party is focused on that. That's our raison d'etre. That's why we're in existence, is to try to create a more just and equitable and sustainable society, and that means working for change. What are the particular changes that we think are going to be needed? And you're going to hear a lot more about this from somebody who's far more expert in it than me tomorrow, Paul Muldoon from SELA. But what we need is a number of key steps to be taken. And the first one has got to be a national safe water piece of legislation that brings our national government to the table and has it take responsibility around water issues. The second, we also have to focus on how water, as such a fundamental part of our ecosystem and of our lives, can be an important part of the policy-making process throughout all of the decisions that we make in government. Because there's no question that Canadians are very concerned about water, increasingly so after the tragedies that got so much publicity. And we need to bring to light the tragedies that aren't reaching the Canadian public consciousness, particularly in First Nations. And we've got to have strong federal leadership to overcome the kind of lethargy that we've seen and the buck passing that has gone on. And our commitment is to make sure that that happens. Let me just review the record just briefly. It's not a very good record, but I think we have to just lay a few facts on the table about the history of our national government and the way that it has addressed water issues. 7 years ago, the Liberal government introduced a piece of legislation called Bill C-14. It was explicitly authorizing the federal minister, the Minister of Health, to establish national drinking water guidelines that would have the force of law after consultation with the provinces. That was 7 years ago. And by the way, the consultation should also be with First Nations, who I notice when they look at setting standards, such as at Yellow Quill, are setting higher standards than our national government. The Liberals never took that bill past first reading. They simply abandoned it, left it on the shelf, and it died. A good idea that should have been pursued. Well, I would give you my commitment today that we will revive and improve upon that proposed legislation, and working with any of you who'd like to help us, and particularly I know that there's work being done by the Canadian Environmental Law Association, and we will bring a law back to the House of Commons, and maybe in this minority parliament we can get it passed. And we'll need your help to do it. We'll need pressure from the grassroots. We'll need help from our provincial colleagues that are taking action. And you mentioned the Saskatchewan minister, and I'm really glad to hear of that presence here at that conference. That's a very strong statement, and we'll be looking forward to their help. 3 years after the Liberals abandoned their action on that bill, we had the Walkerton tragedy. And I am really here, happy to be here with Bruce Davidson, who led that battle. He wouldn't say he led it, but working with the citizens of Walkerton after that tragedy and saying, you know something, we're going to keep working until we make sure that that doesn't happen to other people, and we're going to make the changes that need to happen. It would have been easier perhaps to turn their back on the problem and try and just let it wash away, but they took responsibility, and Bruce has just done a fabulous job in that effort. And I know there are other citizens who are doing the same kind of work in this room. And what I'm saying is that it's time for federal politicians to get moving and see if we can't actually implement some of the things that have been called for as a result of those tragedies. Because after the Walkerton inquiry, a report was done, and that report again said that we should have a National Safe Drinking Water Act. That was a recommendation after one of the most publicized water-related tragedies in Canadian history. And yet the Liberal government took absolutely no action on it. And in 2001, in fact, and I'm still shocked, I almost want to get my fact checkers to see, surely, tell me this isn't true. In 2001, Canada was the only nation to oppose a UN resolution that was going to make access to clean drinking water a basic human right. How could any government vote against the idea that access to clean drinking water would be a basic human right. Well, I have to conclude the only reason that we could have done such a thing is because we were afraid that if we did so, that we could be attacked as a government for not having provided access to clean drinking water to our own people, and in particular to First Nations people. In other words, they didn't want to get slapped with a liability suit. Well, it's time that we took action to change that situation, and we're now dealing with a minority parliament, and who knows, we might actually be able to accomplish that objective now. Right now we have about 800 communities across the country that continue to have to boil their water. And this is in a country that if you asked anyone else anywhere else around the world, they would say, surely you don't have a clean drinking water problem. You've got so much pristine land. This absolutely has to be the last issue on your agenda. But yet we have this crisis, and it's primarily in small communities, as was pointed out by Hans a minute ago. More than 20% of the water systems in Aboriginal communities contain excessive levels of contaminants, and that's only the evidence that we've got. Chances are it could be even worse. And we know that this water has been contaminated by everything from agricultural waste to the improper forest practices, and you name it. The testing of the water in First Nations communities is supposed to be done by Health Canada, but it's inadequate. It doesn't cover the full range of toxic materials that are being discovered in water today. And not only that, but it's very difficult for Aboriginal communities to get the results of the tests when they want to see them. And this is, again, something that should be changed by legislation. A National Clean Drinking Water Act could insist that the communities affected have a right to know what is in their water, because it's so fundamental to our daily lives. Now, in addition to an act, there are some other things that need to be done, because it wouldn't be good enough just to pass a piece of legislation to say that we have a right to clean drinking water. There should be guidelines that have the legal force of a piece of legislation. And there should be a right to know. You've got to provide the resources to the communities so that their water can meet the guidelines that you're going to set. If you come in and simply set the guidelines and then you start to blame the communities for not providing adequate water, that's not fair. And besides, it doesn't make sense, because most of the communities we're talking about would not have those resources. So we believe, and I've, before this life as a politician in the federal scene and in the House of Commons, I was the head of the National Municipal Organization, and we developed a plan there for an infrastructure investment program for water and sewers, $1.8 billion every single year, that would be invested in water treatment systems, sewage treatment systems. With that kind of level of investment, would take about between 10 and 20 years to deal with all of the water systems. Probably it should even be done faster than that. But we think that that's at least a way of getting started. And so we're going to be calling in the next federal budget, which will come down sometime in February, only 4 or 5 months from now. Our party will be taking the position that that budget must have $1.8 billion per year for investment in community water systems so we can get on track to providing clean water for all of our citizens. And that would include Aboriginal communities. So it's not just a question of passing laws, it's also going to be a question of spending money. Now, I notice that they're coming up with $1 billion for health care, many billions of dollars. We'll hear about it tonight in the news, somewhere around 18 billion. But the great tragedy is that many of the health care problems that people are now having to pay to have cured are caused because people are drinking polluted water. And so what we need to do is start to invest funds in the front end, in the prevention of disease, and in the provision of a quality of life for people at the outset. And that means taking a look at not only the treatment of water and the cleaning of water, but watershed management, going back upstream and finding out where the causes of the contamination are coming from, and starting to knock out those causes of contamination one by one through watershed ecosystem planning. I was part of a group, and I'll just wrap up with this story so you can get a sense that sometimes this even happens in big cities. There's something in Toronto called the Don Valley. Most people think of it as a big road, a big expressway, the Don Valley Expressway. Well, it's actually a river valley, of course. And this river valley was used as the dumping ground for pollution for years and years. Industrial pollution, sewage runoff, you name it. It was a disgusting, filthy place. The salmon that used to be there 50 years ago, long gone. Of course, what people were forgetting was that that river, as polluted as it was flowing right into the Toronto Bay, out around the Toronto Islands, and into Lake Ontario, which is exactly where the intake for the drinking water system is for Toronto. So what we were dumping through our toilets, through our sewers, through our factories, was going right out to where the drinking water was coming in. And a group formed up and said, we've got to start to clean up the Don River and bring it back to life. It was called the Bring Back the Don Task Force. It was entirely made up of citizens. The bureaucracy thought we were nuts. Their idea was to take what was left of the river and put it in a giant pipe, and then run that pipe into a huge expanded sewage treatment plant where the sludges could then be incinerated and blown into the atmosphere. That was the good idea of the engineers. I'm not against engineers and experts, but as I think one of Hans's slides said, you know, the experts built the Titanic. The amateurs built the Ark. The citizens came up with the idea of cleaning the watershed through citizen action, by planting trees, by restoring marshes, by breaking down the channelization structures that had been built and restoring the natural ecosystems of the edge of the river, going back up the creeks, getting the creeks out of pipes and putting them back to the surface. And before you know it, the citizens got excited about the fact that there were natural ecosystems and that the herons were coming back. And there was a big celebration when the salmon returned to the Don River. And now the people spend time down in the Don River Valley by the thousands. Bicycle paths have been built. Nobody ever wanted to go down there. They thought it stank and it was ugly and terrible. Well, now it's a fabulous place with all kinds of birds and animals returning to a natural environment. The story is meant to show that if you unleash the power of citizens, you'll be able to accomplish some terrific things. We can, in fact, transform the negative situation that we're facing. And I know you heard from David Suzuki at the outset of your conference, and so you're fully inspired. I could never inspire a group of people anywhere near the way David Suzuki can. But I do want you to know that in Ottawa there is a group of people, and I don't think we're the only political party that's willing to work on this, or the only members of Parliament. I'm not trying to be holier than thou, not for a second. But I am saying that what we have to do to get these politicians moving on these issues is create the political will from the grassroots. We've got to agitate. We've got to call for action. We've got to expose what's going on. And to the extent that you can share with us your stories so that we can take them to the floor of the House of Commons and say, this is what's happening. We need your support from other parties for a national Clean Drinking Water Act, for an investment in the infrastructure, for working with First Nations on a respectful basis, nation to nation, so that we can address these issues properly. If we can mount that kind of pressure over the months to come, particularly in this minority government, I think we can make some real headway. And so my invitation to all of you is to participate in that. If you'd like to do it, you can reach me very easily through our website, ndp.ca. Please go and send us your email, sign up for our newsletter, be part of the dialogue we're having. Whether or not you happen to be supporters of ours, it doesn't matter. And our natural resources critic, Jean Cullen, and our Aboriginal Affairs critic, Pat Martin, will be there to work with me on all of these issues. I know that some of you probably have some questions about how this new House of Commons is going to work, what kinds of initiatives we might be able to take, and I want to make sure that we've got lots of of time for those questions, so I think I'll wrap up my talk now and instead turn things over to questions and also to comments. I'm here frankly to learn. I learned more in the last half hour at this table about the circumstances surrounding some of the communities and some of the solutions that have been developed and the hurdles they've had to go over than I could ever learn sitting around in the House of Commons. I don't want to belittle the comments that other members of Parliament might make, but I don't think I'm going to learn quite as much there as I could learn here. So I'm hoping that you'll share some of your ideas in the next few minutes with us. And you certainly have the commitment of the New Democratic Party of Canada to work on these issues with all our energy with you. Thank you very much for your attention after a long day. I really appreciate it.